Well, welcome to the interesting topic area of intellectual property. Now, intellectual property, which includes copyright, is one of the biggest and most technical areas of the suite of media law topic areas. It can be a whole subject in law school for law students. The Copyright Act is quite a challenging and complex document, and expert lawyers work in this field at an international and national level. That said, journalists and public relations practitioners only need a basic knowledge of intellectual property, mainly so that they can contact a lawyer if they think there is some area of concern. Law students might take a special interest in this, and several of you choose this area for your major assignment topic, and you're welcome to do so. In this mini lecture, though, we'll just touch upon some of the main points just so that we can try to make it digestible. The good thing is that in Australia there is the Copyright Act, so everything is sitting there in a single piece of legislation. Although a lot of the decisions in the courts centre around the interpretation and the wording of some of that legislation, and that's where it gets quite complex. There are several forms of intellectual property, and the textbook talks about the main ones that might impact upon the media in their work. And clearly copyright is the biggest, but important other areas are to do with patents and trademark law. And so this area of preserving or defending the right of someone to their ideas and creations and intellectual creations and outputs is the central theme of intellectual property. It has a global context as well, and culturally many countries have been much more into the sharing, the borrowing of information and other people's ideas. And this has become a point of tension between the actual enactment of intellectual property laws internationally and the enforcement of those laws within certain jurisdictions where there has been much more of a trend towards the borrowing of other people's work. Copyright law is the main area of the law that we need to know about. And copyright is all about really the legal end of what we call plagiarism in ethics. And most of you, as university students, have heard about the term plagiarism, which is, in academic terms, the intellectual borrowing or theft of someone else's work without appropriate attribution, and sometimes with attribution, but where you've used far too many of their words without getting their permission to do so. So while it's dealt with as plagiarism in an ethical way, and plagiarism also exists within the major ethical codes of media practices, the Journalists' Code of Ethics and the PRIA Code of Ethics both counsel against plagiarising the work of others. While that happens, in the legal domain, it is actually actionable. So someone can sue you for a breach of their copyright. The other area of law that overlaps that the textbook talks about is an action known as passing off, where you are actually passing off you're purporting that someone else's work is your own, or you're giving their authorship, their purported authorship, to work that is not actually theirs, but you are doing it in some parody way, pretending it to be theirs. So that centres around someone's right to have work attributed to them, which within copyright is very close to an area of the law that we call moral rights, the moral rights of authors to have work attributed to them. And the other area that relates to this is the area of consumer law, where you can fall foul of consumer law through misleading and deceptive conduct in the course of business as a corporation. And to engage in these sorts of activities to mislead or deceive consumers that something is your output when it really is the output of others can be seen as misleading and deceptive conduct. So what are the basics of copyright? And one of the key things that copyright, the textbook talks about with copyright is that copyright rests not in an idea itself. Copyright is actionable only over the form of expression that has been used. And that form of expression can really be in almost any medium. There are sections of the Copyright Act to do with sound and film and textual work, and of course images are forms of expression, artistic works, and a whole lot of expression using computers in the modern context. So your copyright can rest in your intellectual authorship or creation through your form of expression within any of these media. So to give you a quick example, if I was to say to you that I have a great idea for a film script based around a university college situation where a whole bunch of American study abroad students come here to Australia to study at an Australian institution, and the whole script centres around them partying, engaging in Australian activities, getting into trouble, being bitten by dangerous creatures in Australia, and I outline this script for a television series or a movie based around this experience. I'm very excited about it, but I haven't yet put pen to paper. And I leave that for a couple of months after telling you about this over a cup of coffee, and suddenly I read in the newspaper that you have had a script on this very topic accepted by a Hollywood production company, and you had gone off and actually written out this whole script based around pretty much what I just said to you. Well, it's probably the end of our friendship, but nevertheless, I can't sue you for a breach of copyright over that, because I hadn't actually put that idea into a form of expression. You were the one that had done that. Yes, you've probably been unethical in stealing my idea, but nevertheless, you haven't breached my copyright because I haven't yet had a form of expression to defend. Now, there are many situations, particularly where journalists and sometimes public relations practitioners do need to use other people's forms of expression in their various ways. And what the Copyright Act has are fair dealing exemptions. And you're probably familiar with the fair dealing exemption around educational usage. When you go to the library, you see certain signs on photocopiers restricting how much of a book you might be able to photocopy, that kind of thing. And that's all part of the fair dealing exemption, or if you like to call it, a defence to using someone else's work or to copying someone else's form of expression. For journalists, they are mainly concerned with three fair dealing defences. One centring around the criticism or review, and so that is where it allows you to use a little grab from a film, for example, in a film review segment on television, or a section of a book in a book review in a newspaper. For the reporting of news, sometimes you need to use a grab from a work, because that is central to the story that you're reporting. And more recently, there's been a fair dealing defence for the use of parody or satire. We all know those sorts of late night television shows that'll grab a piece of another station's footage and have a laugh about it because something in the news has happened that's funny. Well, there's a fair dealing defence around that, but limited to how much of that they can use. So what it means is, for example, with the reporting of news, it means that if people are busking in the street and there's a busking festival and you're a television news reporter, you can film that and they may well be playing a musical piece as a busker in which some other musician holds the copyright, but you are able to use a small grab from their performance under the reporting news fair dealing exception. However, if you thought a particular song was really a really neat way of introducing your story, say you wanted to use Pink Floyd's famous song Money to introduce a segment for your financial current affairs program, well, that's not essential to the news of it. It's an addition that you're choosing to use just for added value to the segment. So you would need to actually pay for the use of that to whoever holds the copyright in Pink Floyd's Money song, and otherwise you could be sued for the breach of that rock band's copyright for the use of it there. Now, that's a simple overview. There are many digital dimensions to copyright, and journalists often ask me in training courses, well, can I take that photograph from Facebook for a news story about someone who's been injured or is centre of some major news story? And the answer is that the person who took the photograph, who created the work, is the holder of the copyright. So if, say, it was a nice wedding photograph of a couple who've died tragically in certain circumstances, well, clearly they haven't taken their own wedding photograph, and that copyright would normally rest with the wedding photographer, the professional photographer who took the photograph. So that photographer could sue you for breach of copyright if you went and grabbed it off Facebook, even though it had been posted freely to Facebook by the wedding couple who were in the image. Now, the reality of copyright is that most times these sorts of practices happen and nobody sues, but sometimes you might just get the wrong streak of luck and you may be sued for breach of copyright. So the reality is that in the scheme of all of the breach of copyright that goes on in society, there is very little that is actioned, but sometimes when it is actioned, it can be very expensive for you. The remedies for breach of copyright can be what's called an account of profits, which means that you would need to pay some sort of form of damages and account for the profit you've made from the stealing of someone else's material. But there can also be injunctions to stop you from publishing material because before you've had the opportunity to breach the copyright. The text also mentions the moral rights of authors, and I mentioned this to you a little earlier when we were talking about passing off. It's a similar kind of action, but basically, even if you have sold the copyright in your work, you still have the moral right that such work should be attributed to you as the author of the material, even though you have licensed or have sold your right to action the copyright. So have a good read of the moral rights of authors there as well. And remember, of course, there's much more detail to this, and if you follow your study plan closely, starting with this mini lecture and working your way in more detail through the other activities, you'll have a much better and more detailed knowledge of the area of intellectual property. For the moment, though, please don't plagiarise. We have our academic integrity processes in place, so if you don't get sued for breach of copyright, you might find yourself at the wrong end of an academic integrity finding, which can be also quite a damaging thing. And for journalists, your greatest fear is that if you go stealing someone else's work, that you get exposed on Media Watch as a plagiarist. And that's certainly reputational damage you don't want as a professional. We'll see you next time.